The massive crystal halls of the Galactic Federation shook like they were about to break apart. Loud warning sirens screamed through every corner of the building. Ambassador Kim Tae-ho stood quietly at the back of the room, watching the most powerful alien races in the galaxy completely lose their minds with fear. The Void Swarm was back. After sleeping for 10,000 years in the dark corners of space, they had woken up hungry. And when the Void Swarm got hungry, entire solar systems just disappeared. Gone. Like they never existed at all. Kim Tae-ho had seen the reports. Planets with billions of people living on them, advanced cities that took thousands of years to build, all turned into empty space in just a few hours. The aliens called it consumption. But Kim knew what it really was. It was complete destruction, on a scale that made human wars look like playground fights. High Counselor Vexitar floated at the front of the chamber. He was one of those energy beings that looked like a walking rainbow. But right now his colors were all wrong. Instead of the usual bright blues and golds, he was flickering between dark reds and sick yellows. Fear colors. The Luminal Collective has fallen, Vexitar announced, his voice shaking the air around him. 47 billion consciousness patterns have been consumed. The room erupted in chaos. Representatives from a dozen different alien species started talking at once. Some were screaming in languages that hurt human ears to hear. Others were making sounds that Kim's translator couldn't even convert into words. The crystalline Zephyrians were vibrating so fast they sounded like breaking glass. The floating jellyfish-like Medusans were flashing colors that probably meant very bad things in their culture. Captain Park Sora was floating in her observation ship at the very edge of human space when she got the news. Her job was supposed to be simple: watch what the aliens were doing and report back to Earth. But watching had become a lot more complicated lately. She looked at her communication screen and shook her head. The aliens were having another emergency meeting, and once again humans weren't invited to the important discussions. They never were. To most of the galactic community, humans were useful for exactly three things: mining asteroids, cleaning, up toxic waste, and doing the dangerous jobs that more advanced species didn't want to do. Park Sora had been in space long enough to know how the other species really felt about humans. They thought Earth's people were violent, primitive, and barely worth paying attention to. Human technology was thousands of years behind theirs. Human ships were slow and clunky. Human weapons were crude and ineffective against most alien defenses. But right now, as Park Sora watched the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy fall apart with terror, she wondered if being primitive might actually be an advantage. Back on Earth, Lee Min-ho sat in a dark room filled with holographic displays showing the movement of the Void Swarm across the galaxy. As humanity's chief military strategist, his job was to understand how enemies fought and how to fight them back. For the past few months, he had been studying something that no human had ever seen before. The tactical data was fascinating and terrifying at the same time. The Void Swarm moved like a single organism, but it was actually made up of billions of individual units. Each unit could think, learn, and adapt. When the aliens tried to fight them with energy weapons, the swarm learned to absorb energy. When they used physical projectiles, the swarm developed armor. When they tried cyber warfare, the swarm turned the attacks back on them. Lee Min-ho had watched recording after recording of alien fleets engaging the swarm. The pattern was always the same. The aliens would attack with their most advanced weapons, do some initial damage, and then watch in horror as the swarm adapted and came back stronger. Within hours, sometimes minutes, their best technology became useless. But Lee Min-ho saw something the aliens missed. The Void Swarm was incredibly good at adapting to technology, but their adaptation patterns showed a critical weakness. They had spent 10,000 years consuming civilized species, races that had evolved beyond warfare, species that valued preservation over destruction, cultures that surrendered when defeat became inevitable. The swarm had never encountered a species that fought dirty, that refused to give up, that would rather die than surrender. They had never faced an enemy that actually got more dangerous when cornered. As Lee Min-ho studied the data, a smile slowly spread across his face. For the first time since the crisis began, humanity might actually have an advantage. not because they were more advanced than the aliens, but because they were less civilized. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes being primitive was exactly what you needed to survive. The massive council chamber went completely quiet when Ambassador Kim Tae-ho raised his hand to speak. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy and uncomfortable, like the moment before thunder hits. Around the curved walls of the crystal chamber, representatives from dozens of alien species turned to look at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright contempt. The Vorthan delegate actually laughed, a sound like grinding metal that made several humans in the room wince. The tall, blue-skinned Altarians whispered among themselves in their musical language, probably making jokes about what the mud dwellers from Earth could possibly contribute to this crisis. Even the normally polite cetacean ambassadors seemed to be having trouble keeping straight faces. Kim Tae-ho had expected this reaction. For the past 50 years since humanity joined the galactic community, they had been treated like the new kid in school who smelled funny and wore hand-me-down clothes. Humans did the jobs nobody else wanted to do. They mined dangerous asteroids, cleaned up toxic waste spills, and served as security guards for alien facilities. In the eyes of most galactic citizens, humans were useful muscle, nothing more. But Kim Tae-ho had been preparing for this moment. He had studied every species in this room, learned their weaknesses, understood their fears, and right now, they were all terrified of the same thing. "We volunteer our worlds as bait," Kim Tae-ho announced in a clear, steady voice that carried across the entire chamber. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The Zephyrian crystals started resonating so loudly that the sound hurt everyone's ears. Several of the floating Medusans actually dropped to the floor in shock. The energy being called Vextar flickered between colors so fast he looked like a broken light display. "Barbaric," shouted the Altarian Prime Speaker, her voice rising to notes that only dogs could hear. "You speak of sacrificing entire planets, as if you were discussing the weather. Primitive savagery," agreed the Vorthan war chief, his mechanical voice booming through his translator. "This is exactly what we expected from your violent species." But Kim Tae-ho just stood there calmly, waiting for the noise to die down. He had expected this too. What the aliens didn't understand was that humans had been thinking about this kind of problem for their entire history. General Choi Da-un stepped up beside the ambassador. Her military uniform was covered in scars and burn marks from actual combat, something most of these aliens had never seen. While their species had evolved beyond warfare centuries or millennia ago, General Choi had been fighting real battles her entire adult life. She looked around the room at all the pristine robes, the perfect crystal formations, the flawless energy, patterns of beings who had never known true desperation. Then she started to speak in the same calm voice Kim Tae-ho had used. "You've all evolved past warfare," she said. "That's wonderful for you. It really is. But we never forgot how to fight. Losing battles. The Void Swarm expects two things when they attack a world, either immediate surrender or a quick victory followed by consumption. We're going to give them neither." Dr. Yang Hye-jin moved forward to stand with her fellow humans. As humanity's leading expert on alien psychology, she had spent years studying how different species thought and reacted. Her analysis of the current situation was both simple and terrifying. "Every single species in this room achieved peace through technological advancement," she explained, gesturing toward the assembled aliens. "You became so advanced that warfare became unnecessary. You solved your conflicts through diplomacy, trade, and superior technology. But humans achieved advancement through war. We learned to build better weapons, develop better tactics, and fight harder battles because we had to. The Void Swarm has consumption protocols for every type of civilization they've encountered over the past 10,000 years. But they have no protocols for prey that fights back with genuine, desperate ferocity." The alien representatives were staring at the three humans like they had just suggested eating their own children. To species that had evolved beyond violence, the casual way humans discussed sacrifice and warfare was genuinely horrifying. The cetacean ambassador spoke up, his translated voice carrying tones of deep concern. "You speak of using your own people as weapons, your own worlds as traps. Do you not value the lives of your citizens?" General Choi smiled grimly. We value them enough to spend them wisely. Every human who dies fighting the swarm is a human who dies protecting someone else's family. Every world we sacrifice is a dozen worlds that stay free. You think that's barbaric, but we think abandoning the galaxy to save ourselves would be the real crime. What the aliens couldn't understand was that humans had been preparing for exactly this kind of asymmetric warfare since their species first picked up sharpened sticks to fight predators that were bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than they were. Humanity's entire evolutionary history was a story of the small defeating the large, the weak outsmarting the strong, and the desperate finding ways to win impossible battles. Kim Tae-ho looked around the silent chamber one more time. The void. Swarm thinks they know how this story ends, he said quietly. They've written this story 10,000 times before, but they've never written it with humans as the main characters. The silence that followed was different from before. This time it wasn't dismissive or contemptuous. This time it was the silence of beings who were beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, the primitive humans had a point. The sky above Terra Nova turned black as millions of void swarm drones descended from space like a metal rainstorm. Each drone was about the size of a small car, with razor-sharp edges and energy weapons that could cut through steel like paper. They moved in perfect formation, their collective mind calculating the most efficient way to consume another world. But Terra Nova wasn't like the other worlds the swarm had consumed. Colonel Shin Woo-jin sat in his command bunker, 3 stories below the capital city, watching his tactical displays light up with enemy contacts. There were so many red dots on his screen that they looked like a solid mass of color. Any reasonable military commander would have surrendered immediately. The odds were impossible. Victory was not an option. But Colonel Shin wasn't trying to win. He was trying to make the swarm pay such a high price for Terra Nova that they would think twice about attacking the next human world. All units, this is command, he spoke into his communication device. Remember, we're not here to survive. We're here to teach these things that humans bite back. Above ground, the city was already burning, but instead of running in panic like the civilians on other worlds had done, the people of Terra Nova were fighting back. Every man, woman, and teenager had been trained in basic combat. Every building had been rigged with explosives. Every street, corner had been turned into a potential ambush site. Sergeant Park Ji-hai led her squad through the rubble-filled streets, moving from building to building like ghosts. Her squad consisted of 12 soldiers, but they weren't fighting like any military unit the swarm had encountered before. They didn't try to hold territory or defend positions. Instead, they used hit-and-run tactics designed to kill as many drones as possible before moving to the next target. "Contact front," shouted Private Kim Dong-soo as a group of swarm drones rounded the corner. Instead of taking cover and returning fire like normal soldiers, Park Ji-hai's squad did something unexpected. They charged. The drones' adaptive algorithms were confused. In every previous battle, organic beings had tried to avoid close combat. They used ranged weapons and defensive positions, but these humans were running straight at them, with explosive charges and melee weapons, turning every encounter into a suicide attack. Park Ji-hai tackled a drone twice her size, wrapping her arms around it, while her squad mates poured gunfire into its companions. She knew she was going to die, but she also knew that her death would take several drones with her. That was the math that mattered. The swarm's collective consciousness began to register something it had never experienced before. Usually, resistance decreased over time as defenders were killed or gave up hope. But on Terra Nova, the resistance was actually getting stronger. Every human who died seemed to inspire 10 more to fight harder. 15-year-old Cho Min-ji was supposed to be in the evacuation shelters with the other children. Instead, she was running ammunition to soldiers on the front lines. When a swarm drone spotted her and gave chase, she didn't scream or try to hide. She led it straight into a trap where 3 older boys were waiting with homemade explosives. 60-year-old Mr. Lim had run a small restaurant before the invasion. Now he was building bombs in his kitchen and teaching other civilians how to make them. When the drones finally broke into his building, they found that he had turned the entire structure into one massive booby trap. The explosion took out half a city block, along with dozens of enemy units. Captain Lee Yu-jin was flying his fighter ship through the smoke-filled sky above the city when he received the final order from Colonel Shin. His squadron was down to just 3 ships, and they were almost out of ammunition. The smart thing to do would be to retreat and live to fight another day. But Captain Lee had studied the tactical data. The swarm learned from every encounter. If they were allowed to consume Terra Nova easily, they would be even more efficient. When they attacked the next human world, the only way to help the rest of humanity was to make this victory as expensive as possible. "Razor Squadron, this is Lead," he broadcast to his remaining pilots. "Time to show these things what humans do when we're backed into a corner." The 3 fighters turned toward the largest concentration of swarm ships and pushed their engines to maximum speed. They weren't trying to win a dogfight, they were turning themselves into guided missiles. "Tell the galaxy we held the line," Captain Lee transmitted, as his ship slammed into a swarm mothership, triggering a chain reaction that destroyed 6 other enemy vessels. Dr. Kim So-young was monitoring the battle from a research ship in orbit, collecting data that would be crucial for humanity's next stand. What she was seeing should have been impossible. The swarm's adaptive algorithms were designed to learn from every encounter and become more efficient. But instead of adapting to human tactics, the drones were starting to show something that had never been recorded in 10,000 years of swarm history. They were hesitating. For the first time ever, swarm units were pausing before entering buildings, taking longer to advance through streets, and showing what could only be described as caution. The collective consciousness that controlled billions of drones was learning to count the cost of victory. When Terra Nova finally fell 12 hours later, the Void Swarm had accomplished their objective. The planet was theirs, and its population was consumed. But the victory had cost them nearly 30% of their invasion force. In previous battles, they had typically lost less than 5%. As Dr. Kim So-young compiled her final report, she realized that something fundamental had changed. The swarm had won the battle, but humanity had won something more important. They had planted a seed of doubt in an enemy that had never known doubt before. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes losing a battle was the first step toward winning a war. After Terra Nova fell, the Void Swarm moved on to the next human world, expecting an easier fight. They had learned from the first battle and adapted their tactics. Their collective consciousness calculated that the second planet would fall much faster. They were wrong. New Seoul lasted 18 hours instead of 12. Then came New Tokyo, which held out for 26 hours. By the time the swarm reached New Busan, each human world was costing them more time, more resources, and more drones than the last. Admiral Jo Seung-ho sat in his command center on Earth, watching the tactical displays that showed the slow but steady advance of the Void Swarm through human space. Each red dot on his screen represented a colony that had been consumed, a world full of people who had died fighting. But those red dots also represented something else, victories that were becoming increasingly expensive for the enemy. Implement Pyrrhic protocols across all remaining colonies, Admiral Jo ordered his staff. The Pyrrhic protocols were humanity's most desperate strategy. Every world would be turned into a trap designed to hurt the swarm as much as possible before falling. The name came from an ancient Earth king who won battles but lost so many soldiers that victory became meaningless. That was exactly what humanity was trying to do to the Void Swarm. Commander Han Mi-rae received the Pyrrhic protocol orders while standing in the ruins of New Busan's capital city. The swarm had been attacking for 6 hours, and the city was already half destroyed. But instead of the usual panic and evacuation, something extraordinary was happening. Children as young as 10 were running through the combat zones, carrying ammunition and medical supplies to the adult fighters. They moved through the rubble like they were playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek, always staying one step ahead of the swarm drones. When 8-year-old Park Soo-bin got cornered by a drone, she didn't scream or cry. She pulled the pin on a grenade her grandfather had given her and smiled. The elderly citizens of New Busan had their own role to play. 70-year-old Mrs. Lee used her knowledge as a former nuclear engineer to rig the city's fusion reactor with a manual detonation system. When the swarm finally broke through the last defensive line, she would turn the entire city into a bomb that would take thousands of enemy units with it. "They're not just fighting," Commander Han reported to Admiral Zhou. "They're competing to see who can take the most drones with them when they go." Across human space, similar scenes were playing out on every world. Farmers were turning their fields into minefields. Teachers were instructing children in guerrilla warfare tactics. Doctors were learning to make explosives from medical supplies. Every human citizen had become a potential weapon. General Moon Tae-young studied the data from his command ship, positioned just outside the combat zone. As humanity's leading expert on enemy behavioral patterns, his job was to figure out how the swarm was adapting to human tactics. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. "They're slowing down," he reported to Earth Command during his daily briefing. "Each world is taking longer to consume. The swarm is becoming more cautious, more careful. They're actually starting to fear what they might encounter." The behavioral analysis was fascinating. On their first world, the swarm had attacked with overwhelming force and speed. But now they were taking time to study each planet before attacking, sending scout units to probe for traps, and keeping larger reserves in case of unexpected resistance. "We're teaching them that some prey bites back hard enough to matter," General Moon explained to his staff. "For 10,000 years, they've been consuming civilizations that either surrendered quickly or put up token resistance. Now they're encountering a species that gets more dangerous the more desperate they become." Dr. Kang Yerin was watching the battle reports from her research station when she received an urgent request from the Galactic Council. The alien representatives wanted to understand what humans were doing and why they were doing it. To most galactic species, humanity's tactics looked like senseless brutality. She opened a communication channel to the council chambers where representatives from dozens of species were gathered in emergency session. Many of them looked sick or disturbed by the reports they were receiving from human space. "You see brutality," Dr. Kang began, her voice calm and clinical. "We see mathematics. Every drone destroyed here won't be available to consume your worlds tomorrow. Every hour the swarm spends fighting us is an hour your people have to prepare better defenses." The Altarian representative interrupted her. "But the cost, the loss, of life. How can you justify such sacrifice?" Dr. Kang smiled grimly. "Because we're not fighting to win individual battles. We're fighting to make them lose the war. The swarm has always operated on the principle that consumption is profitable. We're making it unprofitable." She brought up a holographic display, showing the swarm's resource expenditure over the past month. The numbers were staggering. Each human world consumed was costing the swarm more energy, more time, and more units than entire star systems had cost them in previous campaigns. "Look at the data," Dr. Kang continued. "The swarm started this campaign with approximately 10 billion combat units. They've lost nearly 2 billion fighting just 4 human worlds. At this rate, they'll run out of units before they finish consuming our space, let alone yours." The room fell silent as the alien representatives processed this information. They were beginning to understand that humanity wasn't just fighting a desperate last stand. They were implementing a strategy that could actually work. "But what about your people?" asked the Cetacean ambassador. "What about your families, your children?" Dr. Kang's expression softened for just a moment. "Our children are carrying ammunition through battlefields because they know that if we don't stop the swarm here, there won't be any children left anywhere. Our elderly are rigging bombs because they remember what it was like when humans had to fight for survival every single day." She paused, looking directly at each alien representative. "You evolved beyond warfare because you achieved safety. We're achieving safety by refusing to evolve beyond warfare. And right now, that's exactly what the galaxy needs." The transmission ended, leaving the Galactic Council in stunned silence. For the first time since the crisis began, they were starting to believe that maybe the Void Swarm could be stopped. But the price would be paid in human blood, and humans seemed willing to pay it. The question was, would it be enough? The Terran defense perimeter was humanity's last line in space. Beyond this invisible boundary, there was nothing but empty vacuum. and the fleeing evacuation ships, carrying millions of alien refugees to safety. Behind the human fleet, the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy were running for their lives, abandoning their homeworlds to escape the advancing void swarm. Fleet Admiral Lim Jae-sung stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Soul's Pride, watching his tactical display with the calm expression of a man who had already accepted his fate. The display showed 200 human ships arranged in a loose formation across several thousand kilometers of space. Facing them was a swarm fleet so massive that the sensors couldn't get an accurate count. The enemy ships stretched from one edge of the display to the other, a solid wall of metal and death moving toward them at incredible speed. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, "we're detecting approximately 50,000 swarm vessels in the primary assault wave. Estimated time to contact, 47 minutes. Admiral Lim nodded calmly. 200 ships against 50,000. Any military academy in the galaxy would call those impossible odds. But Admiral Lim hadn't graduated from a normal military academy. He had learned warfare in the brutal ground campaigns on the outer colonies, where humans had spent decades fighting enemies that outnumbered them 100 to 1. "Open a channel to all ships," he ordered. Throughout the human fleet, ship captains and crew members stopped what they were doing to listen to their admiral's final words. On the bridge of the destroyer, Incheon's hammer, Captain Baek Soo-jin put down the technical manual she had been studying and focused on the communication display. "All ships, this is Admiral Lim," came the calm voice over the speakers. "In 30 minutes, we're going to face the largest enemy fleet in recorded history. We have no chance of winning this battle in any traditional sense. We don't have enough ships, enough weapons, or enough time to defeat them." On the cruiser Daigu's Revenge, Commander Park Hyun-woo smiled grimly. He had served under Admiral Lim for 15 years and knew exactly what was coming next. "But we're not here to win," Admiral Lim continued. "We're not here to survive this. We're here to make sure they remember us. We're here to show the Void Swarm that some prey fights back so hard that victory becomes meaningless." Captain Baek Soo-jin looked around her bridge at her crew of 28 officers and enlisted personnel. Most of them were young, some barely, out of the military academy. But they all had the same expression on their faces, determination mixed with a kind of fierce joy that only humans seemed to understand. The human fleet wasn't arranged in any defensive formation that the swarm had seen before. Instead of spreading out to maximize their firepower or forming defensive screens to protect their larger ships, they had arranged themselves for maximum ramming effectiveness. Every ship was positioned to crash into as many enemy vessels as possible when the time came. "All Marines prepare for boarding operations," came the next order over the fleet communications. Major Kim Do-hyun was strapping on his combat armor in the Soul's Pride when he heard the order. As the fleet's senior Marine commander, he would be leading the most dangerous mission in military history, boarding enemy ships during the middle of a space battle. The plan was simple and completely insane. When the human ships rammed into the swarm vessels, teams of Marines would use the impact to board the enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand in corridors that were never designed for biological life. They would be fighting in zero gravity in toxic atmospheres against enemies that could adapt to their weapons in real time. "Remember," Major Kim told his Marines over the communication system, "we're not trying to capture these ships. We're trying to destroy as many of them as possible from the inside. Every swarm vessel we take out here is one that won't be attacking civilian targets tomorrow." 20 minutes before contact, something unexpected happened. Long-range sensors detected movement in the alien evacuation fleet. Several ships had broken formation and were turning back toward the battle zone. "Admiral," reported the communications officer, "we're receiving a transmission from the Altarian heavy cruiser Starlight's Edge. They're requesting permission to join the battle line." Admiral Lim was genuinely surprised. The Altarians had been among the most vocal critics of human military tactics. Their representative had called humanity's defensive strategy barbaric and senseless. "Patch them through," he ordered. The voice that came over the speakers was calm but determined. "Admiral Lim, this is Captain Zaraketh of the Starlight's Edge. My crew and I have been watching your preparations for the past hour. We understand now what you're trying to do. We request permission to stand with humanity in this final battle. Before Admiral Lim could respond, more ships began breaking formation. Zephyrian crystal ships, cetacean biovessels, even some of the energy beings had manifested physical forms to join the battle. Within minutes, the human fleet had doubled in size, but it still wasn't enough. The swarm fleet was simply too massive. Lieutenant Colonel Park Min-seo was piloting her heavy bomber, the Gwangju's Fury, when the battle finally began. She had loaded her ship with every explosive device they could fit, turning it into a flying bomb that could take out several enemy vessels if she could get close enough. The space around the defense perimeter erupted in fire and metal as the two fleets collided. Human ships rammed into swarm vessels at maximum speed, their hulls cracking and their crews dying in the impact. But each collision took multiple enemy ships with them. Park Min-seo managed to pilot her bomber deep into the enemy formation before a swarm interceptor finally brought her down. But instead of ejecting or trying to escape, she did something that no swarm algorithm had predicted. She aimed her damaged ship directly at the largest enemy vessel she could find and pushed her engines to overload. "Attention all swarm units," she broadcast on all frequencies as her ship's reactor went critical. "You want to consume everything, then choke on us first." The explosion that followed took out not just her target, but two other swarm dreadnoughts that had been positioned nearby. The chain reaction lit up space like a small star and sent shockwaves through both fleets. But it was what happened next that changed everything. For the first time in 10,000 years of conquest, the Void Swarm's collective consciousness experienced something that had never existed in their eternal hunger: doubt. The mathematical certainty that had driven them across the galaxy for millennia was suddenly filled with variables they couldn't calculate. How do you consume a species that turns consumption into a weapon? How do you defeat an enemy that becomes more dangerous when they're losing? As the last human ship exploded in a blaze of nuclear fire, taking 3 more swarm dreadnoughts with it, the ancient enemy made a decision that shocked every observer in the galaxy. They stopped advancing. The Void Swarm, which had consumed countless civilizations and never known defeat, began to withdraw. Not because they had been defeated. They still had thousands of ships remaining, but because humanity had convinced them that some prey simply wasn't worth the cost of hunting. The galaxy would remember the species that held the line when all hope was lost. And somewhere in the dark corners of space, the Void Swarm would remember them too.